Margaret Sullivan stood at her kitchen counter, morning light streaming through the windows as her fingers trembled, holding the wedding invitation, not one addressed to her, but one she'd found accidentally tucked between magazine pages. Her neighbor had borrowed and returned. The elegant script read, David Michael Sullivan and Elena Rose Martinez, with a date just 3 weeks away. Her only son, her David, getting married without her. The invitation slipped from her fingers, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. She pressed her palms against the cool marble counter, trying to steady her breathing. The kitchen, once filled with laughter and David's friends doing homework around the breakfast bar, now felt cavernous and cold. Margaret walked to the living room, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors David had helped her install 5 summers ago, back when he still called every Sunday. The photographs lining the mantelpiece told their story in frozen moments. David's first day of school, graduation, college acceptance, first apartment keys. The timeline stopped abruptly 3 years ago. She sank into her reading chair, the same one where she'd spent countless nights helping David with homework, reading him stories, and later, listening to his dreams. From here, she could see the framed photo of David's father, Michael, taken months before the car accident that claimed his life when David was only 8. I tried so hard, Michael, she whispered to the photograph. Maybe I tried too hard. The memory surfaced David at 17, his face flushed with anger, shouting that she was suffocating him, that she needed to let him make his own mistakes. She'd only been trying to protect him from the same drunk drivers who'd taken his father. But David had seen it as control, as distrust. College had created more distance. David had chosen UCLA deliberately, she suspected, to put an entire continent between them. He'd come home for holidays those first 2 years, but the visits grew shorter, his participation more perfunctory. By his junior year, he was spending holidays with friends' families after graduation. He'd stayed in California, found a job in tech, rented an apartment in Santa Monica. Their phone calls became weekly check-ins, then bi-weekly, then sporadic. Margaret had tried to bridge the gap by visiting, but David always seemed busy. Distracted, the last time she'd seen him was 18 months ago at a family barbecue. David had been stiff, formal, speaking to her like she was a distant relative rather than the woman who'd raised him single-handedly for 14 years. Now he was getting married, and she wasn't invited. Margaret picked up her phone and scrolled to David's contact. She typed, "Hi, sweetheart, hope you're well. Just wanted you to know I'm thinking of you." The message showed as delivered. Then read. Minutes passed, then an hour. No response came. The doorbell rang, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw her neighbor Mrs. Chen holding a covered dish. "Margaret dear, I made too much soup again," Mrs. Chen said, though they both knew she made extra portions specifically to share. "Chicken and dumplings, your favorite." Mrs. Chen stepped inside, her sharp eyes immediately taking in Margaret's red-rimmed eyes and the wedding invitation on the kitchen floor. She set the soup on the counter and gently picked up the invitation. "Oh, Margaret," she said softly, "your David is getting married." The kindness in her voice broke something loose in Margaret's chest. The tears she'd been holding back finally came. "I wasn't invited," Margaret managed. "My own son is getting married, and I wasn't invited." Mrs. Chen guided her to the kitchen table. "Tell me what happened." "I don't know where I went wrong, Helen. After Michael died, I tried so hard to be everything David needed. Maybe I held on too tight, but I was terrified of losing him too, and now I have anyway. You haven't lost him, hurt him maybe, but he's still your son. That doesn't change because of one wedding invitation you didn't receive." They sat in comfortable silence. Finally, Mrs. Chen spoke again. "Have you thought about reaching out to him before the wedding? Not to ask for an invitation, but to clear the air. To let him know that, despite everything, you love him and want him to be happy." That evening, Margaret sat at her computer, staring at a blank email screen. Finally, she settled on something simple. "David, I heard about your engagement to Elena. I know we haven't been close lately, and I take responsibility for my part in that distance. I want you to know that whatever has happened between us, I am proud of the man you've become, and I want you to be happy. I hope Elena brings you all the joy you deserve. I love you, Mom." She hit send before she could change her mind, then went to bed knowing sleep would be elusive, but hoping tomorrow might bring some response. But morning came with no reply, and the silence stretched on. 2 weeks before the wedding date, Margaret received an unexpected call from her sister Linda. "Margaret, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it. I got an invitation to David's wedding." The words hit like a physical blow. Linda lived in Portland, saw David maybe once a year. If Linda was invited and Margaret wasn't, the exclusion was deliberate and complete. "I'm not going," Linda said quickly. I wouldn't feel right celebrating when you're not there. Linda, no. Don't boycott his wedding because of me. He needs family. There. But Linda had already made up her mind. The wedding day arrived, gray and overcast in Boston. Margaret spent the morning in her garden pulling weeds with unnecessary violence, trying to exhaust herself enough that the grief wouldn't have room to breathe. At what she calculated would be the ceremony time in Los Angeles. Margaret sat in Michael's chair with a photo of David's childhood and tried to imagine her son happy, smiling as he married the woman he loved. As evening approached, Margaret made a decision that surprised even her. She drove to the local courthouse, where she'd filed papers to become David's sole guardian after Michael's death. She sat in the parking lot for a long time, remembering that day when she'd sworn to protect and provide for her son. But as she sat there, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. Something was stirring in the back of her mind, a memory of documents she'd signed years ago, papers she'd forgotten about in the aftermath of Michael's death, something about a trust, about provisions made for David's future. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a spark of something other than despair. Not hope, exactly, but curiosity. She drove home through the darkening streets and began to remember things she'd buried beneath 22 years of single motherhood and grief, things that might change. Everything 3 months after David's wedding. Margaret received a certified letter that would alter everything she thought she knew about her family's financial situation. The return address belonged to Whitmore, Cassidy, and Associates, the law firm that had handled Michael's estate after his death. Inside was a letter from James Whitmore III, son of the attorney who had originally handled Michael's affairs. The younger, Whitmore explained that his father had recently passed away, and during the transition of client files, several discrepancies had been discovered in old estate documents. The letter requested Margaret's presence to discuss matters concerning the Sullivan family trust. Margaret read the letter 3 times. She had no knowledge of any family trust. After Michael's death, she'd received his life insurance payout. His 401k and the house had been transferred to her name. There had been no mention of a trust. Tuesday afternoon found Margaret in the elevator of a glass tower in downtown Boston, rising to the 30th floor offices of Whitmore, Cassidy, and Associates. James Whitmore III was perhaps 40 years old, with prematurely gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He greeted Margaret warmly. "Mrs. Sullivan, thank you for coming in. I apologize for the mysterious nature of my letter, but I wanted to explain everything in person." He gestured to a chair. Across from his desk, "I have to admit, Mr. Whitmore, I'm completely confused. I've never heard of any family trust." Whitmore nodded sympathetically. "That's not surprising. My father was old school in his approach to client confidentiality, sometimes to a fault." He pulled a thick folder from his desk drawer. "The Sullivan Family Trust was established by your late husband, Michael, approximately 6 months before his death. According to my father's notes, it was meant to be a surprise for your 10th wedding anniversary." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. Their 10th anniversary had been just 2 weeks after Michael's funeral. "The trust was structured rather unusually," Whitmore continued. "Your husband deposited his entire inheritance from his grandmother, approximately $800,000 at the time, into an investment account managed by the trust. The terms specified that the principal could not be touched for 25 years, but all investment gains were to be used for your son David's education and future needs." Margaret stared at him in shock. $800,000. "Michael never told me about any inheritance. According to my father's notes, your husband wanted it to be a surprise. The tragedy of his death meant that information was never conveyed. My father should have explained all of this to you at the time, but his notes suggest he was concerned about overwhelming you with complex financial matters while you were grieving. So what happened to the money?" That's where things get complicated. The trust was managed by an investment firm that my father had worked with for decades. Over the past 22 years, through careful management and market growth, the trust has grown to approximately $3.2 million. Margaret gripped the arms of her chair. $3 million. The 25-year restriction period ends next month. At that time, the entire amount transfers to your son David as the primary beneficiary. Margaret had struggled to pay for David's college expenses, had taken on extra tutoring work, had driven a 10-year-old car and delayed home repairs, all while millions sat in an account she didn't know existed. "But there's a problem," Whitmore continued carefully. "When my father passed away and we began auditing his files, we discovered that the investment firm managing the trust has been irregular in their reporting and management practices. We have reason to believe there has been significant misappropriation of funds." "What does that mean?" "It means we think someone has been stealing from your family's trust for years. And Mrs. Sullivan, there's something else. 3 days ago, someone claiming to be David Sullivan contacted the investment firm and attempted to initiate an early withdrawal from the trust. Margaret's blood ran cold. That's impossible. David doesn't know about the trust either. Are you certain of that? The next morning brought another surprise. Margaret's doorbell rang at 8 a.m., revealing a courier with another certified letter. This one was from a law firm in Los Angeles, David City. The lawsuit claimed that Margaret had systematically undermined David's relationships, driven away potential romantic partners, and created emotional distress that required years of therapy. It sought damages of $500,000 and a restraining order preventing Margaret from contacting David or his wife Alina. Margaret read the letter twice, then called James Whitmore immediately. "I'm not surprised," Whitmore said. "This confirms our suspicions that there's coordination between the trust situation and other legal actions. Mrs. Sullivan, I think you need to understand that you're being targeted by people who want to gain control of that $3.2 million. And they're using your son to do it. You think David is being manipulated? I think your son may have been approached by people who convinced him that you've been hiding money from him. It's a common scam with large trusts criminals research. The beneficiaries create fake grievances, then offer to help recover money that was allegedly being withheld." Margaret felt a flicker of hope. If David was being manipulated rather than actively criminal, there might be a way to reach him. What do I do? First, we countersue to protect the trust and recover the stolen funds. Second, we respond to your son's lawsuit with the truth that you never knew about the trust, never had access to it, and couldn't have withheld it because you didn't know it existed. That afternoon, Margaret called Linda. "Margaret, is everything okay?" "Linda, I need to ask you something. After David's wedding, did anyone contact you asking questions about our family's finances?" There was a pause, actually. "Yes. A woman called about 2 weeks after the wedding. She said she was doing genealogy research and wanted to know about Michael's family background, especially his grandparents. She seemed very interested in whether there had been any family money passed down." Margaret's heart sank. "Did you give her any information?" "I told her what I knew about Michael's grandmother, about how she'd lived in that big house in Beacon Hill and always seemed well off." "Margaret, did I do something wrong?" "No, Linda, you couldn't have known. But I think David and I are both being targeted by people who want to steal money that Michael left for us." Margaret explained about the trust, the lawsuit, and her growing suspicion that David was being manipulated. "My God, Margaret, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to fight for my son," Margaret said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I'm going to fight for the money his father left him, and I'm going to fight to show him the truth." That evening, Margaret sat in her garden as the sun set behind Michael's roses. For the first time since learning about David's wedding, she felt something other than grief or confusion. She felt angry at being lied to, angry at having money stolen from her family, angry at seeing her son manipulated by criminals. But underneath the anger was determination. She'd protected David from everything she could when he was young, and she would protect him now, even if he was too blinded by lies to see that he needed protecting. The fight was coming whether she wanted it or not, but this time Margaret wouldn't face it alone and uninformed. This time, she would walk into battle with the truth as her weapon and the law as her shield. The Boston courthouse was a monument to justice, its granite steps worn smooth by decades of people seeking resolution. 2. Life's messiest problems. Margaret climbed those steps on a crisp October morning, 6 months after learning about the trust that had changed everything. Beside her walked James Whitmore, carrying a briefcase that contained compelling evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and manipulation. Behind them came Linda and Mrs. Chen, who had declared that Margaret needed proper moral support. The lawsuit had evolved into something far more complex than anyone had initially imagined. Margaret's attempt to recover stolen trust funds had expanded to include criminal charges against the investment firm, a countersuit against David's alienation of affection claim, and now a federal investigation into what appeared to be a sophisticated fraud scheme. Margaret hadn't seen David in person for nearly 2 years, but she knew he would be in the courtroom today. When David walked in, Margaret's breath caught. He looked older, harder somehow. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, and when their eyes met across the courtroom, his expression was cold. Distant next to David sat a woman Margaret assumed was Elena Petite, dark-haired, beautiful in a polished way. The third person at David's table was a man Margaret didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired with confident bearing. This must be the Los Angeles attorney who had filed the alienation of affection lawsuit. Judge Patricia Hernandez entered at precisely 9 a.m., her black robes flowing behind her. She was younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps 50, with steel gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent eyes. "Good morning," Judge Hernandez said. "We're here today to hear consolidated cases involving the Sullivan Family Trust." allegations of embezzlement, and related civil claims. This is going to be a complex proceeding, so I want to establish some ground rules. She looked directly at both tables. I've reviewed the case files, and this is one of the most convoluted family financial disputes I've seen in 15 years. On the bench, we have allegations of criminal fraud, family estrangement, and enough emotional baggage to sink a ship. My job is to sort out the legal facts, not to provide family therapy. However, when cases involve family trusts and allegations that parents have hidden assets from children, I take those matters very seriously. So let's get to the truth, shall we? James Whitmore stood to present Margaret's case first. He walked the judge through Michael's establishment of the trust, the investment firm's management of the funds, and the discovery of apparent embezzlement that had been going on for over 20 years. Your Honor, Mrs. Sullivan had no knowledge of this trust's existence until she was contacted by our firm 6 months ago. She has never benefited from these funds, never had access to them, and certainly never withheld them from her son. He presented bank records showing Margaret's modest teacher's salary, her careful budgeting, and her occasional financial struggles during David's college years. Then he showed the trust's investment records, highlighting the excessive fees and suspicious withdrawals. When Whitmore finished, David's attorney, Richard Blackwood, stood to present their case. His approach was aggressive from the start. Your Honor, Mrs. Sullivan's claims of ignorance, strain, credibility. She was married to Michael Sullivan for 10 years, was the executor of his estate, and had access to all of his financial records. The idea that she never knew about an $800,000 trust is simply not believable. Blackwood painted a picture of Margaret as a controlling, manipulative mother who had driven David away through years of emotional manipulation and overbearing behavior. Then, Judge Hernandez did something unexpected. She called for a brief recess and asked to see both attorneys in her chambers. Margaret watched them disappear, leaving her alone with her supporters on one side of the courtroom and David with his wife and legal team on the other. The silence was heavy. Margaret found herself studying David's profile, looking for traces of the child she'd raised in the stern-faced man he'd become. When he glanced her way, she tried to smile, but he looked away quickly. After 20 minutes, the attorneys returned, both looking shaken. Judge Hernandez resumed her seat, and Margaret noticed that her expression had hardened considerably. Ladies and gentlemen, during our conference, some additional information has come to light that significantly changes the nature of these proceedings. She looked directly at David's table. Mr. Blackwood, I'm going to ask you some very direct questions, and I expect honest answers. Are you familiar with a company called Meridian Financial Services? I may have heard the name, Your Honor. That's interesting, because Meridian Financial Services is the parent company of Coastal Asset Management, the investment firm that, allegedly, embezzled funds from the Sullivan Family Trust. And according to documents that have just been brought to my attention, Meridian Financial Services has been paying your law firm a monthly retainer for the past 8 months. The courtroom went deadly quiet. Margaret saw David's head snap toward his attorney, confusion and alarm evident on his face. Furthermore, it appears that Meridian Financial Services has been the source of funding for Mr. David Sullivan's alienation of affection lawsuit against his mother. In other words, the very people accused of stealing from his trust fund have been paying to sue the woman they stole from. David half rose from his chair. That's impossible. I paid for this lawsuit myself. Sit down, Mr. Sullivan, Judge Hernandez said sharply. Mr. Blackwood, would you care to explain how your client could be paying for legal services with money that was allegedly provided by the defendants in this embezzlement case? Blackwood's confident demeanor had crumbled completely. Your Honor, I can assure you that my client was not aware of the funding source. I'm sure he wasn't, but you were, weren't you? Bailiff, please ensure that Mr. Blackwood doesn't leave this courtroom until I've finished with him. Judge Hernandez turned her attention to David directly. Mr. Sullivan, I want you to listen very carefully. Based on the evidence presented here today, it appears that you have been the victim of an elaborate fraud designed to separate you from your mother and gain control of your inheritance. David's voice was barely above a whisper. I don't understand. Let me explain. 8 months ago, you were contacted by people who claimed your mother had been hiding money from you. They offered to help you recover this money and even provided legal representation. What they didn't tell you is that they were the ones who had been stealing that money for over 20 years. Margaret watched her son's face as the truth began to dawn. The confusion, the disbelief, and then something that looked like horror. They convinced you to cut ties with your mother because they needed her isolated so they could continue embezzling funds. When she discovered the trust's existence and began investigating, they escalated their manipulation of you, using you as a weapon against the very person who was trying to protect your inheritance. Alina stood up suddenly. This is ridiculous. David, we don't have to listen to this. Mrs. Elena Sullivan, Judge Hernandez said coldly. I suggest you sit down and remain quiet, unless you'd like to join your attorney in explaining your role. In this conspiracy, Elena sat down hard, her face flushed with anger and fear. Judge Hernandez pulled out a thick folder. Mr. David Sullivan, I have here phone records showing extensive communication between your wife's cell phone and executives at Meridian Financial Services, dating back to before your engagement. I have bank records showing that your wedding was partially funded by money traced back to your own embezzled trust fund. David looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He turned to Elena, his voice hoarse. Elena, what is she talking about? Elena. Silence was answer enough. Mr. Sullivan, I believe you need to understand that your marriage itself may have been part of this fraud. Your wife appears to have been working with the people who were stealing your inheritance. The courtroom erupted in chaos. David was on his feet, demanding answers from Elena, who was now crying. Blackwood was arguing with Whitmore while the bailiff moved closer to maintain order. Judge Hernandez banged her gavel repeatedly. Order. Everyone sit down and be quiet, or I'll hold you all in contempt. When silence finally returned, she addressed the courtroom with gravity. Here's what's going to happen. Mr. Blackwood, you are suspended from practicing law in this state pending investigation. Mrs. Sullivan, you are being held as a material witness and will surrender your passport. Finally, she looked at Margaret. And David, Mrs. Margaret Sullivan, you are hereby granted full control of the Sullivan Family Trust as rightful trustee. Mr. David Sullivan, you are the rightful beneficiary of this trust, and you will receive every penny that belongs to you once we've recovered what was stolen. But first, I think you owe your mother an apology. The words hung in the air. David sat frozen, staring at his hands, while Margaret held her breath. Slowly, David raised his head and looked across the courtroom at his mother. Margaret saw 22 years of hurt and misunderstanding in his eyes, but also something else: recognition. Perhaps? Or the beginning of understanding. Mom, he said, his voice breaking on the word. Mom, I'm so sorry. Margaret felt the first crack in the wall that had separated them for so long. She wanted to run to him, to hold him like she had when he was small. But she stayed in her seat, knowing that some bridges had to be rebuilt one careful step at a time. I know, sweetheart, she said softly. I know. Judge Hernandez cleared her throat. I'm calling a recess while we sort out the criminal charges. But before we adjourn, I want to say something to both of you. She looked at Margaret first. Mrs. Sullivan, you have shown remarkable grace under pressure. You fought for your son's inheritance even when he was actively working against you. That's what real love looks like. Then she turned to David. Mr. Sullivan, you've been the victim of a sophisticated fraud, but you're also an adult who chose to believe strangers over the woman who raised you. You have some serious thinking to do about what kind of man you want to be going forward. As the courtroom began to empty, Margaret remained in her seat, watching David speak in urgent whispers with Elena. Whatever Elena was telling him, it was clear from David's expression that he wasn't buying it anymore. For the first time in almost a year, Margaret felt hopeful, not because the money would be recovered, but because David finally knew the truth. He finally understood that she had never been his enemy, had never withheld anything from him, had never stopped loving him despite the distance between them. The judge had called her to the altar of justice today, and justice had finally been served. But more importantly, the truth had been revealed. And sometimes truth was the only foundation strong enough to rebuild a family on the coffee shop. David had chosen for their first real conversation in 3 years was neutral territory, a bustling Starbucks in downtown Boston, far from both of their homes and full of strangers who wouldn't care about the drama unfolding at the corner table. 2 weeks had passed since the courtroom revelation that had shattered David's world. Elena was facing federal fraud charges. David's marriage was over, though the divorce proceedings were complicated by the criminal case. The investment firm's executives were in custody, and forensic accountants were working to untangle 20 years of embezzlement. When David walked through the door, Margaret's breath caught. He looked exhausted, older than his 30 years, carrying the weight of a man who discovered that most of his adult life had been built on lies. Hi, Mom. The words still sounded strange coming from him after so much formality, but it was a start. Hello, sweetheart. Thank you for agreeing to meet. David sat across from her, fidgeting with his phone, clearly struggling with where to begin. I don't know how to do this, he said finally. I don't know how to apologize for believing that you were capable of stealing from me. I don't know how to explain why I trusted strangers over my own mother. Margaret reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He didn't pull away. Maybe we start with the truth, she said. All of it. The mistakes I made, the things you believed, what really happened between us. David nodded, his eyes filling with tears he was trying not to shed. I was so angry with you for so long, Mom, After Dad died, I felt like I couldn't breathe sometimes. Every decision I wanted to make, every risk I wanted to take, you had a reason why it was dangerous. Margaret felt the familiar stab of guilt. I was terrified of losing you too. Your father's death was so sudden, so random. I started seeing threats everywhere, but I handled it wrong too. Instead of talking to you about it, I just ran away. First to college across the country, then I stayed in California. Then I started avoiding calls and visits. Afraid of what? David was quiet for a long moment. Afraid that if I let you back in, if I let myself need you again, something would happen to you too. It felt safer to keep you at a distance. The honesty in his voice broke something open in Margaret's chest. She'd spent years wondering what she'd done wrong, never considering that his withdrawal might have been motivated by the same fear that had driven her overprotection. So when Alina came along, Margaret said carefully, and she told you I was keeping money from you, ... It felt like confirmation of everything I'd already decided about you. That you were controlling, that you didn't trust me to make my own decisions. David's voice was bitter with self-recrimination. Alina had an explanation for everything. Why you'd never told me about the trust, why you were living modestly while hiding millions. When did you first meet Alina? At a coffee shop in Santa Monica about a year and a half ago. She bumped into me tearily, spilled her latte all over my laptop. I thought it was charming, spontaneous. Now I realize it was probably planned. Margaret felt a surge of anger toward the woman who had manipulated her son so skillfully, but she kept her voice neutral. What did she tell you about the trust? She said her ex-boyfriend had gone through something similar that his mother had hidden, an inheritance from his grandfather. She said these things were more common than people realized, that parents sometimes convinced themselves they were protecting their children by controlling their inheritance. The sophistication of the manipulation was breathtaking. Alina hadn't just lied, she'd created an entire narrative that played on David's existing resentments and fears. She introduced me to people who claimed they'd been through similar situations. Support groups, they called them. Other adults whose parents had kept them from their inheritance. They had stories, documentation, legal precedents, and the lawyer, Blackwood. Alina said he specialized in these kinds of cases, that he'd helped dozens of families recover stolen inheritances. He offered to work on contingency, said he was passionate about fighting family financial abuse. David's voice cracked. I actually thought I was doing something noble, Mom. I thought I was standing up to a parent who'd been lying to me my whole life. Margaret squeezed his hand. They were very good at what they did. David, you weren't the first person they'd targeted, but I should have known. I should have at least called you, asked you directly about the trust, before filing a lawsuit. You were being manipulated by professionals, sweetheart. They knew exactly which buttons to push, exactly how to exploit the real issues between us. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of all those lost years settling between them. The investigators say Alina was working with the investment firm from the beginning, David said, eventually. They have emails going back almost 2 years before she even met me. They were looking for the trust beneficiary, planning how to approach me, how to separate me from you so they could continue stealing without interference. And the wedding? David's face flushed with shame. Paid for with money stolen from my own trust fund. The venue, the flowers, the photographer, all of it was bought with Dad's money. That was meant for my future. Alina knew. She had to have known. Margaret felt her heart break for her son. To discover that your marriage was a lie was devastating enough. But to learn that your own inheritance had been used to pay for the ceremony was cruelty, beyond comprehension. I loved her, Mom, or I thought I did. I can't even tell anymore what was real and what was performance. Maybe some of it was real, Margaret offered gently. People are complicated. David shook his head. The FBI showed me recordings of phone calls between Alina and her handler at the investment firm. She called me the mark and the target. She talked about managing my emotions, about keeping me isolated from you. The pain in his voice was raw, immediate. Margaret wanted to gather him in her arms, but she sensed he wasn't ready for that kind of comfort yet. I'm so sorry, David. I'm sorry they hurt you like this. You were protecting me. You were fighting for my inheritance, even when I was actively working against you. Even when I sued you, you never stopped trying to recover the money Dad left for me. You're my son. That's what mothers do. David finally looked up at her, and Margaret saw the boy she remembered in his eyes, vulnerable, seeking reassurance, needing to know he was still loved despite his mistakes. Can you forgive me, Mom? Can we find a way back to each other? Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks. Oh, sweetheart, there's nothing to forgive. If anyone should apologize, it's me. I should have been a better mother after your father died. I should have found a way to help you process your grief instead of smothering you with my own fears. We both made mistakes. Yes, we did. But we're both here now and we both want to do better. That's what matters. David reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. I wanted to give you this. Margaret opened it to find a wedding invitation, the one she'd discovered by accident, but a new one, handwritten in David's careful script. It was addressed to her and dated for the following month. I don't understand. I want to have another wedding, Mom. A real one this time. Just a small ceremony, maybe in your garden if you'll let me. I want to marry someone who loves me for who I am, not what I'm worth. And I want my mother there to walk me down the aisle, since Dad can't. Margaret stared at the invitation, confused. But David, your marriage to Alina is being annulled as part of the criminal case? But Mom, I've met someone. Her name is Sarah, and she's a nurse at the hospital where I've been going for therapy. She knows everything about what happened. About the fraud and the manipulation and how badly I screwed up with you, and she still thinks I'm worth knowing. Margaret felt a flutter of panic, then stopped herself, hearing the echo of her old, overprotective instincts. David was 30 years old, had been through hell, and had emerged with hard-won wisdom. He didn't need her to protect him from his own choices anymore. Tell me about Sarah. David's face lit up in a way Margaret hadn't seen since he was a child. She's incredible, Mom. She's kind and funny, and she doesn't care about the money or the legal drama. She just sees me, the real me. How did you meet? She was the nurse who helped me when I had a panic attack during one of my FBI interviews. Instead of treating me like a victim or a criminal, she just treated me like a person who was having a really bad day. We started talking and ... double quotes, David's smile was genuine, unguarded. Mom, I want you to meet her. I want her to know the woman who raised me, the woman I should have trusted all along. Margaret felt warmth spreading through her chest. Her son was healing, learning to trust his own judgment again, ready to build genuine relationships based on truth rather than manipulation. I would love to meet her and David. I would be honored to walk you down the aisle. They talked for another hour, filling in details of the past 3 years, sharing memories of Michael, discussing the ongoing legal proceedings. It wouldn't be easy. There was too much hurt on both sides, too many ingrained patterns to overcome quickly. But for the first time since David had left for college, Margaret felt like she had her son back. As they prepared to leave, David hesitated. Mom, there's something else. The trust fund, even after they recover all the stolen money, it's going to be worth around $4 million. I want to split it with you, David. No, that money is yours. Your father left it for your future. My father left it for his family. You're part of this family too, Mom. You sacrificed so much for me after Dad died, and you never had access to money that could have made your life easier. That's not right. Margaret started to protest, but David held up his hand. Besides, I've learned something about money over the past few weeks. It's just a tool. It can be stolen, it can be used to manipulate people, it can destroy relationships if you're not careful, but it can also be used to build things, to help people, to create security. I want to use Dad's money the way he would have wanted to. Take care of the people he loved. Margaret felt tears threatening again. Your father would be so proud of the man you've become. I hope so. I have a lot of making up to do. As they walked out of the coffee shop together, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, hope for the future. Not just hope that she and David could repair their relationship, but hope that he would build a good life, filled with people who valued him for who he was. The road back to each other would be long, marked by therapy sessions and difficult conversations, legal proceedings and family dinners that might be awkward at first, but they would travel that road together as a family should. Margaret had waited 3 years to hear her son call her mom without reservation. She'd waited even longer to see him smile with genuine happiness, unencumbered by manipulation or fear. As they parted ways outside the coffee shop, she knew the waiting was finally over. Her son was coming home. Not just to Boston, but to himself. To the values she and Michael had tried to instill in him. To the kind of love that didn't come with conditions or hidden agendas. 3 months later, on a perfect autumn day in Margaret's garden, surrounded by Michael's roses and a small gathering of people who loved them both, Margaret walked her son down an aisle of fallen leaves to meet Sarah, a young woman whose eyes held the kind of genuine warmth that couldn't be faked. As she placed David's hand in Sarah's, Margaret felt Michael's presence in the golden afternoon. Light, in the familiar scent of the roses, in the joy on their son's face. This was what justice looked like, she realized. Not punishment or revenge, but restoration. The return of what had been lost, the healing of what had been broken, the triumph of truth over deception. As David and Sarah exchanged vows, they had written themselves promises based on honesty, respect, and genuine affection. Margaret stood in the front row of folding chairs, tears streaming down her face, finally able to give her son the wedding gift she'd always wanted to offer. Her unconditional love and complete support. Freely. Given and joyfully received, the trust fund had been recovered. The criminals were in prison, and justice had been served. But this moment? Watching her son marry someone who truly loved him while surrounded by people who cared about his happiness, rather than his net worth, was worth more than any amount of money. Margaret had learned something about inheritance during this ordeal. The most valuable things parents leave their children aren't found in bank accounts or investment portfolios. They're found in the lessons about love and resilience, the modeling of integrity under pressure, the demonstration that some relationships are worth fighting for, no matter how difficult the battle becomes. As the ceremony concluded and David kissed his new wife, Margaret felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Mrs. Chen dabbing at her own eyes with a lace handkerchief. "That's what a real wedding looks like," Mrs. Chen whispered. "No one trying to steal anything, no hidden agendas, just two people who choose each other and the families who choose to support them." Margaret nodded, too overwhelmed with gratitude to speak. The judge had called her to the altar of justice, but life had called her to something even more precious, the altar of redemption, where broken relationships could be mended and lost. Love could be found again as the reception began on the patio Michael had built with his own hands. Margaret watched her son dance with his new wife, their faces glowing with uncomplicated happiness. The road to this moment had been long and painful, marked by manipulation and betrayal, legal battles and heartbreak. But every step had been worth it to arrive here, at a celebration of genuine love, surrounded by people who had chosen each other freely and completely. Margaret raised her glass of champagne as David prepared to make a toast, knowing that whatever words he spoke, they would be his own, spoken from his heart, honest and true, and utterly free from manipulation. The judge had called her to the altar and justice had been served, but love, Margaret realized, had been calling them home all along.